Hola, buen día. ¿Cómo les va? Hola, Zaira. Hola.
Hello, how are you? Welcome. It's a great pleasure to see you all here and to be in touch with you all again. I'd like to welcome all members, observers of the Punta del Este Declaration. I would like also to welcome members and observers from the Global Forum, to panelists and guests and colleagues. It's a great pleasure for us, and we're very proud to welcome you to the fourth Punta del Este Declaration Initiative meeting, and most especially to the presentation of this report on tax transparency in Latin America 2021. Marcia was saying just now that it's good to meet virtually like this because we can reach all corners of the world and we have a great many attendees, but it would have been a good idea to see you face to face and be able to give you a hug as well. To see you all here in Buenos Aires would have been wonderful. But that will be for the future, I hope, at any rate. I think that for all of us that have taken part in all this, the common denominator is the fact that we're convinced that illicit financial flows, and particularly tax avoidance and evasion, are a systemic problem, a very serious one too, for the world in general and for developing countries in particular, because they objectively place limitations on our country's capacity to manage public policy and to develop public policy too, and to implement priorities in development and social policy too. Avoidance and evasion erode what we try to do, and it gives rise to unfairness and a lack of equity, both vertically and horizontally. Those people that avoid or evade their tax obligations means that there is a great deal of inequality amongst taxpayers. Can you hear me well? Yes, yes, we hear you very well. We know that this places conditions on the possibility of funding social policy, and I think that this has become evident in this last pandemic. And we did talk about this at past meetings. This pandemic, what it has generated is a clear-sightedness as regards inequalities in our region. There's still a great deal of inequality. It has also highlighted how important it is for states to have enough room for maneuver and enough financing ability to attend public health emergencies and to do something to protect the health of our population, and also to mitigate the social and economic impact of a pandemic such as this. There's something else I wish to add. One of the goals of our policies has to do with how we improve collection, tax collection or revenue collection, and how can we do this in the most fair way amongst those who carry the heaviest tax burden. We have had recent contributions. We have taxed those that have the greatest wealth in Argentina, and this is an interesting example of what can be done, because the pandemic has forced us to react quickly faced with an emergency and see how we can collect tax revenue from those that are better able to pay, given the current circumstances and the current crisis. And in Argentina, we are also taking part very actively in an international debate on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, because we find them very important. And we find it very important, too, that the needs and rights of developing countries be taken into account. We want to be the main protagonist in these debates, in this discussion, in order to guarantee that as a result of this discussion, we have a fair, level playing field for everyone. And we hope that developing countries then can participate to as full an extent as possible. The new agreement is signed on the 1st of July is an interesting point of departure. It's not the end of discussion, but it's the beginning of a dialogue, of a very interesting and very enriching dialogue, which we feel has to lead to a more in-depth discussion on how to create capacity and provide funding opportunities to the least developed countries. Anything that has to do with increasing tax transparency and exchange of information in this context is very important, because so one of the most fundamental tools that we have in developing nations to tackle tax planning, tax evasion, and tax avoidance issues. We know that all these mechanisms for tax planning, for tax evasion and avoidance, and tackling avoidance and evasion, it does have an impact on our taxable base. And the automatic exchange of information and the automatic exchange of country by country reports has changed radically the way in which tax administrations work. Up to now, they worked blindly, really, when it came to capital, when it came to wealth of their residents that lived, that harbored that wealth outside, offshore. So these mechanisms are there to help and enhance transparency. They are mechanisms aimed at exchanging information, and they are key instruments because they will contribute to diminish disequality between North and South. It will provide information that will help us fight illicit financial flows. I think that the exchange of information upon request can be used much more now than in the past. When using automatic exchange of information and when using local tools, we can obtain a great deal more information than we could in the past. So we feel in our tax administration that it's key to participate in this area of international cooperation. We find that it is strategically important too to bring our voice to bear in this discussion, to be heard in this discussion. And we would like to make our experiences known, even if I say so myself, and that we share our experiences, because we hope that these will provide a contribution when it comes to guaranteeing better quality and more information and making it accessible to all developing countries. As regards the accessibility of information, we are trying and continue to try and improve and update our system so that we can not only receive but also send information automatically, and also to improve the effective use of the information that we receive. Of course, we always guarantee confidentiality of the same and traceability too of information throughout the process. We also feel that it is important to continue to find or try and find solutions or systems that will allow an effective use of the information we receive and we send. We've discussed this in the past, in many meetings in the past. In the preliminary meeting on the Punta del Este Declaration, we discussed that how we can guarantee access to information, but also how can we have capacity to deal with it effectively. And that means not only human resources, but also the physical ability or aptitude to implement and use the information we receive effectively. So it's a great honor to be here today and to present this Punta del Este Declaration Progress Report. It was launched in 2018 by the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes. The Punta del Este Declaration with other Latin American members and partners, and they are key when it comes to deploying the elements of the initiative in our region, in other words, the exchange of information, and when it comes to guaranteeing too that they will benefit from the very powerful tools it contains. So there are 13 Latin American countries that participate in this initiative now. I'm not going to repeat what the main goal is. We are all aware of it, but it is of great interest to us and to the entire region that all countries participate so that we can promote equality within our countries and between our countries in our region overall, so that we can push ahead with development. I think that this is a priority for all of us, that we include in this declaration the 7 remaining countries in Latin America. 2 of these countries, Mexico and El Salvador, already are observers and members of the Global Forum. In the third meeting in November last year, the members outlined a future working plan and how to develop capacity in the framework of the declaration, this for the period 2021 to 2023. And this was founded on the 2 pillars that I referred to earlier on, the setting up of robust structures by tax administrations in order to ensure a proper exchange of information, highlighting the strengthening of technical capacity, and also developing activities in order to make tax transparency and exchange of information in something that will result in better tax collection and better mobilization of domestic resources. We are aware that this working plan cannot be fully implemented without political commitment. That's very important, and that applies to all countries. And awareness too on the part of policymakers, those that take decisions, awareness of how important tax transparency is when tackling tax avoidance and evasion and illicit financial flows. This awareness raising of those that take decisions and set up public policy is fundamental in order to make any progress and achieve our goals. Today, we're going to present the 2021 progress report, and it's the first edition of what will be a series of annual reports. The report is part of the different efforts that Latin American countries undertook. We are very happy with this initial report, and we hope it will help us increase tax transparency and the exchange of information agenda in the region. Since 2016, Latin American countries have developed greatly. Even in 2020, during the pandemic, we have continued to make progress when it comes to tax transparency and exchange of information. We have tried to continue to consolidate this. It is being consolidated at the moment, I think, in our region. The main conclusions in the tax transparency progress report for Latin America will be presented by Saida Manata, who will follow on from me. Everybody knows who she is. She is head of the Global Forum Secretariat. I'd like to share with you some of the main statistics which illustrate the progress made. Automatic exchange of information has allowed Latin American countries to identify more than 12 billion euros of additional tax collection from 2004. 298 million euros correspond to the exchange of information upon request. These figures that I've just quoted are the tip of the iceberg, because all countries in the region have access to tools that allow them to effectively and efficiently make use of the exchange of information tools. The report also reflects what countries have done when it comes to implementing infrastructure and networks which allow for continuous exchange of information. And this paves the way for effective exchange between tax administrations, the Inter-American Development Bank, the CIAT, and the World Bank Group have supported the work and the initiative of the Punta del Este Declaration. We would like to thank all those organizations, all those partners that we have who have supported us in this agenda for tax transparency and greater exchange of information on tax matters in Latin America. The agenda for the fourth meeting of the Punta del Este Declaration initiative meeting, which begins today with this public webinar, is very promising indeed. Between today and tomorrow, the member states, and as well as observers, as well as partners, will discuss the challenges and progress made in this context when it comes to meet the standards for tax transparency and the improvements in tax collection, which help fund our countries and the capacity that we have for greater social and economic inclusion and greater public policy. We wish you here in Buenos Aires that the debate is fruitful, and we hope that we can continue to make progress tackling evasion and illicit financial flows in Latin America. And I think that this is a mechanism which will allow us to do that, as well as any improvements we can introduce when it comes to tax transparency and international exchange of information. So welcome, and we can continue. Zaida, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Mercedes. Buenos días, buenas tardes a todos, dependiendo de donde se encuentren.
Thank you, Mercedes. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. It's a real pleasure for me to be here and to present this report to you. I'd like to ask, I think, either Juliana or somebody to assist with the presentation, please. It's also a pleasure to be here with so many colleagues and friends. We go back a very long way in our work in the field of taxation and transparency. This is the first report, as Mercedes has just said, of a series of reports, and we do hope that it will be a long series of reports. And the idea with it is to give you a status report and explain how things are in Latin America, what the developments of recent years have been, and also what we still have yet to do in order to achieve fiscal transparency in the region. The objective or the purpose of the declaration is to make the best possible and effective use of information that's exchanged according to all the international transparency standards in order to tackle tax evasion and also other illicit financial flows such as corruption. Illicit financial flows are a great concern to all governments across the world. They are one of the main causes of loss of revenue and resources for countries and have a very negative impact on resource mobilization and the development agenda, globally speaking, for the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the CEPAL. The Latin American region is actually losing out on large amounts of revenue due to illicit financial flow. And it represents about 6.1%, in fact, of the region's GDP. And in this struggle or fight against illicit financial flows and tax evasion has really come to the forefront during the pandemic. And as Mercedes has just highlighted, countries now have pressing needs for resources and revenues in order to finance the cost of the pandemic and also to implement government policies. So against this backdrop, exchange of information and cooperation between nations becomes even more important, as it's key if we're to continue to mobilize resources and develop the region. The Punta del Este Declaration, which was signed first back in 2018, seeks to tackle tax evasion and corruption and other illicit financial flows. And Latin American countries have engaged and committed through a very firm decision to use every form of administrative cooperation open to them under the international agreements that exist to promote transparency and create synergies in the region in order to move forward together. At the third meeting of the declaration last year, many important steps were taken and decisions made, such as a work plan for the period 2021 to 2023. And this plan is focused specifically on two areas of action. One is to undertake actions to establish baselines to understand the capacities and skills for those implementing the plans and other complementary actions that will help to, once an infrastructure has been created to exchange information, understand what the basic needs are in each different country in order to make fiscal transparency enforceable and therefore increase income. So we need to establish baseline actions. We need to do capacity building for auditors. We need to ensure wider use of information, effective use of CRS, and effective access to beneficial ownership information. And this requires an infrastructure, a basic infrastructure, if we are to then be able to use this infrastructure effectively and generate resources that will come from exchange of information. So at last year's meeting, we discussed government action in terms of the initiative in order to galvanize a greater engagement in the region. And it's a pleasure and with great satisfaction that we have Mercedes from Argentina with us. She's the first chairperson of the initiative, and Elizabeth Guerrero from Costa Rica, from the Ministry of Finance, who is the vice president of the Declaration for 2021. We've had very strong support and the commitment of Latin American countries to tackle corruption and illicit financial flows. We have 13 signatory countries, as has already been said, and 2 observers. We have intense cooperation between our regional partners, the FIAT, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And if it wasn't for their support and partnership, it would not have been possible for us to do everything we've done so far this year and be where we are today. So it's a delight and a great satisfaction that they've been able to join us for these next 2 days. The declaration also sets out some very specific steps to be taken and objectives in terms of transparency and information exchange in order to make use of and generate national resources. The purpose is to increase political commitment to tax transparency and exchange of information, and build awareness by disseminating the benefits these instruments bring in order to guarantee as well that politicians and decision makers are aware and committed to the initiative and improve tax transparency and exchange of information. And we now have to develop the next steps and, where necessary, build the competences and capacities of officials so that they can effectively implement mechanisms of transparency and exchange of information. So we're partnering with others in the region in order to bolster the legal basis that can guarantee access and existence of information. We're also doing our best to improve existing infrastructures, especially by setting up effective and efficient units that are skilled and able to exchange information and to strengthen the capacities of auditors and tax inspectors so they can implement these policies effectively. Also, we are assisting countries in the use of information obtained through automatic information exchange mechanisms to understand how they need to prepare for this automatic exchange and how to benefit from the information they receive. This is a progress report that shows what the region has achieved so far. And as I have already said, we have information which has been generously provided by 13 member countries of the declaration and 2 observer countries, and a third which is not a member of the Global Forum, but who has participated, and we're delighted that they did, and that's Bolivia. So I'd like to share with you the outcomes of this work. First of all, I'd like to say that exchange of information is clearly a priority in Latin America. Information exchange is very complex. It requires effort in revising laws, introducing new laws, and putting into place administrative procedures, and therefore requires international commitment and engagement through bilateral or multilateral agreements. So for this, as I said, the technical and political commitments have to be at the very highest level. These are absolutely essential because they are a necessary condition for this work to be successful. What you will also see in the report is that from this perspective, Latin America is very well placed. The commitment to information exchange is very firm. More than 80% of countries say that exchange of information is high on their list of priorities, or is very high on their list of priorities. And this level of priority is motivated by the need to tackle illicit financial flows and tax evasion. There are only 3 countries who didn't respond, but that is due to the existing organization in the country and the limitations they face in terms of exchange of information. So this means that the tax inspectors need to be better skilled, and there's also still a need for networks to be set up to promote and facilitate exchange of information. As I've already said, an infrastructure is necessary for this to happen. There has to be a very solid network of a very robust administrative network and departments able to undertake this exchange of information if they are to take part effectively in the initiative and the mechanism. So there are a certain number of basic things that need to exist. The Latin American countries in partnership are creating the necessary support in order to facilitate exchange of information. And as you can see, this is becoming very productive and positive, as you can see on the slide. On the organizational side, 15 countries actually have a unit within their tax administration devoted to exchange of information, and they have delegated the competent authorities function for that purpose of exchanging information in order to ensure that the work doesn't entail too much red tape and can work with ease, and exchange of information can be facilitated. You'll also see that in Latin America, countries are guaranteeing that the officials that work in this field are properly trained and have the necessary skills and knowledge in order to undertake the work. So 15 countries have said that they do, in fact, have a toolkit to provide that sort of training and support to officials involved in exchange of information. And 15 countries have the tools with which to control and understand where the requests for information are coming from, what their status is, and obviously to do the follow-up. Finally, this is an area that continues to be priority to the skill building program of the Global Forum. We recently published a toolkit that shows how to set up and run an effective exchange of information unit within your tax administration, and that toolkit is available for you to be downloaded from our webpage. The results have also shown that there is still a need to do more insofar as capacity building in the region in this specific field. Out of the 16 countries, half of them felt that their staff's knowledge level was very high or high. The other 50% felt that it's average, it's not as good as it should be, and they still require further support. So the Global Forum and the other partners in the region are committed to continuing to provide training courses and toolkits, etc., in order to support countries in their efforts to develop these skills. We've also created a series of online courses, obviously with the pandemic in mind, but we also felt that they are very opportune and will allow us to reach out to far more people and provide them access to this kind of training. Just last year, we had 1,120 officials from Latin America taking part in these virtual training courses, and there will be other future initiatives in order to ensure that we're helping the countries in the region to create this culture and make the most of what exchange of information can provide. Latin American countries have also expanded their network of agreements, and this is particularly because they are part of multilateral conventions on mutual assistance on tax matters. We have more than 140 jurisdictions participating in this convention, and Latin America is participating and taking part in this exchange. In fact, 14 of the 16 countries are actually party to the convention. Latin America is very close to completing the cycle. For Paraguay, they will deposit their instrument of ratification for the MACC in the next month or so, and Honduras has also expressed its interest in becoming part of the convention. So, as I say, we're very close to getting all countries in the region on board and participating and using this very powerful instrument, which will give them access to information from 160 plus countries. Last year, we launched the initiative to create a toolkit on how to become part of the MACC. And again, that toolkit is available for download to countries in the region. So here, as you can see, Latin America has sent more requests for information that it's received. There was a very sharp increase in 2016, and that was down to a very specific factor. And the news of information that meant that a lot of exchange of information requests were issued between countries due to the news in the international press.
There
was a slight reduction in 2020, and I think that we can take that as a result of the pandemic. Even though countries in the region are participating, there are still disparities between the number of requests and the distribution of the requests. In Latin America, only four countries accounted for more than 94% of the requests, and of these, one country alone accounted for 61.5% of the requests. So, as we see this, these results indicate that we need to provide greater support to countries of the region so that they can make greater use of this instrument, and that they continue to use the instrument when it comes to supporting their tax audits, their investigations and inspections, etc. This is the next slide, and it has to do with beneficial ownership and how it's being implemented in the region. Implementing this concept is not easy. It's challenging. It's not easy in Latin America, nor is it easy in any region of the planet. In Latin America, beneficial ownership frameworks are in early stages of implementation, and in most countries, there are deficiencies in their legal framework, so it needs more attention, especially in the monitoring and supervision of beneficial ownership obligations. One point which is analyzed in the report is that the sources of beneficial ownership information in many countries are not very diversified, and very few countries have implemented central registries for beneficial ownership. This is not necessary given the standard on transparency and exchange of information is not a requirement. However, according to the Global Forum's experiences, when these mechanisms are implemented, access and management of up-to-date information is much easier. So in the experience of the Global Forum, it is a more effective, more efficient way of having access to the information and to keeping it up to date and complete. Here you can see that 8 countries in Latin America were reviewed up to now by the Global Forum. And they show that the number of beneficial ownership information sources used versus the ratings received in element A.1, which relates to the availability of legal and beneficial ownership information on entities and legal arrangements. There is a trend. There's a trend for those countries that have information from diverse sources and a central register have a greater rating, generally speaking. Generally speaking, Latin American countries normally use their anti-money laundering laws for their beneficial ownership legal frameworks and to have access to that information. And they supplement it with a few additional sources of information, mostly the entities themselves. Currently, there are only 6 countries in the region that require beneficial ownership information to be centralized. There are Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay. In the region, the automatic exchange of financial account information is important. But this has to progress a bit more in the region because the automatic exchange of information is a turning point in the fight against tax evasion. We have about 100 jurisdictions currently that already exchange financial account information automatically, and we have 115 jurisdictions that are committed to doing so by 2023. So there's a significant commitment in the region. There are 9 countries that are already exchanging information, and Ecuador has committed to doing so this year. We have, however, still 6 other countries that have not yet committed to implementing the AEOI standard within a certain time frame or deadline. So support will continue to be provided to encourage more Latin American countries to take a well-informed, robust decision to embark on the AEOI journey, because it is a benefit, a great benefit to all participating countries. That's quite clear. A key element is technology, of course. So you have to invest in the necessary networks and the necessary IT technology, especially to guarantee the confidentiality of the information, and the security element is important too. To this end, the Global Forum has published a toolkit. It did that last year. That's on confidentiality management and information security. So as you know, the exchange of information is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. And the end is to enable tax administrations to ensure compliance with their tax laws and also to raise additional revenue. So 6 Latin American countries reported raising additional revenue as a result of the EOIR. And Mercedes pointed out that this reached a total of almost 300 million euro. So these are encouraging figures. But it's also important to note that only one country accounted for 86.2% of the total revenue raised, which means that not all countries in the region are benefiting in the same way from the standard. So there is room for progress there in order for it to benefit other countries in the region. It's worth pointing out too that these figures might not be the final figures, but they are the figures that the countries could report to the Secretariat of the Global Forum. There are many countries that do not monitor the amount of additional revenues collected through the exchange of information mechanism. So it's necessary to monitor this so that countries can effectively evaluate the benefits that this instrument is generating for them. Finally, since 2014, there was a very significant amount of additional revenue, which was raised from voluntary disclosure programs in the countries in the region. The countries of the region identified amounts up to 12 billion euro in the region with this program. Well, the next thing I wanted to share with you has to do with the help and assistance we have provided during the pandemic. 10 countries in the region benefited from technical training, our programs for technical training. 3 Latin American countries benefited from an induction program, which is a comprehensive technical assistance program. And it was created for all Global Forum members post 2015. 7 countries benefited from a tailor-made assistance program. The Latin American region, including the Caribbean, received 21% of all technical assistance provided by the Global Forum Secretariat. That was last year in 2020. Then we had 2 regional seminars about beneficial ownership and 2 regional seminars on how tax auditors can use the exchange of information mechanism as support in their auditing functions and their investigations. I'm not going to mention the new e-learning courses and toolkits. I've already mentioned them. But they are e-learning courses and toolkits which can provide guidance and support to countries and administration staff. So if we go on looking to the future then, ahead, we have a very solid agenda looking ahead, and we want to support countries in the region so that they can make progress. The biggest challenge continues to be the pandemic in the region, but things are improving with vaccinations, etc. But resources are necessary, the exchange of information and tax transparency are going to be key in any recovery, and in order to have sustainable development after the pandemic finishes. So what we want to do is consolidate the implementation of the EOIR standard, especially by training exchange of information units and tax auditors. We also need to provide support to countries so that they can strengthen their legal and operational frameworks, especially on beneficial ownership, and so that countries can increase the number of requests that they send to partner jurisdictions. We don't want you to send requests just for the sake of it, but we want the requests that are sent to be increased if they are useful. And with the exchange of information, automatic exchange of information, the idea is to provide support to those countries that don't have a specific date to begin using both forms of exchange, and so that those countries that do use it, so that they can effectively use these mechanisms, because they're very useful and very relevant when it comes to tackling tax evasion. We also have the use of information to tackle illicit financial flows, especially corruption and money laundering. And then finally, the countries in the region have committed to guarantee a greater tax transparency, and they will advocate for fiscal transparency at the region and outside the region. I think I'm coming to the end now of my presentation. I would like to thank all donors who contribute, because without them, it would be impossible for the forum to continue its technical capacity creating mechanisms. Thank you. Thank you very much, Zaida. That was very interesting indeed, and the conclusions of the report actually are very interesting indeed. And the challenges that we are yet to face too are many. I am now going to introduce Mrs. Emma Aguiman, who's the global tax correspondent of the Financial Times, because she's going to moderate panel 1. The title of which is to mobilize in revenue for development in Latin America. So I would like to give the floor to Emma.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Welcome to today's panel, which has been mentioned, is about mobilizing revenue for development in Latin America. My name's Emma Aguiman, and I'm global tax correspondent at the Financial Times. I'm really excited to be moderating this event today and looking at the growing importance of tax transparency across Latin America. And we heard about how critical it really is to increase in tax revenue across the region, especially in the context of this horrible pandemic we've all had to go through. So we have a very distinguished and knowledgeable panel today, which I'm delighted to just very quickly introduce. First, we have Ben Dickinson, who is head of the Global Relations and Development Division at the Centre for Tax Policy and Administration of the OECD. Next, we have Marcelo Estevao, Global Director of the Macroeconomics Trade and Investment Global Practice at the World Bank Group. We also have Maria Jose Gade, Chair of Global Forum. Marcio Verdi, Executive Secretary at the Inter-American Center of Tax Administrations, and that's CIAT for short. We also have Emilio Pinada, Chief of the Fiscal Management Division of Inter-American Development Bank, and Julian Ruiz, Deputy General Director of Control at the Federal Administrations of Public Revenues of Argentina. And finally, Luis Marino, Tax Justice Coordinator of the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice. So thank you all very much for joining me today. And I think you'll agree, very, very lots of expertise on the panel. So I, for one, am very interested to hear about the insights and the challenges and the progress that has been made in this area. And I thought it was important to kind of just set the scene, as I see it from a journalist perspective, as to why this is an interesting and important issue, tax transparency, and in particular, the exchange of information. So there were a couple of things that stood out to me from the report, just in terms of stats, which I thought set the scene for why this is important. First, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean estimates that Latin America loses significant tax funds due to evasion and aggressive planning. And in 2018, this was estimated to be around 6% of the region's GDP. I also thought it was, quite something that approximately 900 billion euros of Latin America's wealth is estimated to be held offshore. So I feel that that gives us a really strong understanding of why this is such a pressing issue. So just going to kick off with some questions to the panel first. But after that, there will be time for a Q&A from the audience. So please make sure you post questions in the chat, and I'll try my best to get in as many of them as possible. But first, just to kick off, the first part of the discussion, I'd like to speak to Ms. Garde of the Global Forum first. Say hello. And I really just wanted to ask, because the Global Forum and other partners have been involved in not just this Latin American initiative to promote tax transparency, but also in other regional developments and initiatives. And I just wanted to understand, what have been the results of working with other regions, and why do you think it's important to take a regional approach?
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Emma. ¿Se me oye bien? Sí, es que estoy con el móvil y no...
Yeah, I can hear you.
Muy bien, pues como digo, muy buenas tardes, Emma. Gracias, Mercedes, también.
Good afternoon, Emma. Thank you, Mercedes, the chair of the initiative, and also Saida for presenting the report as the chair of the Global Forum. Really, I can only express my pride at the fact that this initiative has been created in Latin America on transparency and exchange of information. The Global Forum has been committed to transparency for a long time. It's created with that objective in mind, and in terms of membership and outcomes, the figures are spectacular. Also, as the chair and as a Spaniard myself, I'm particularly proud of this Latin American initiative, which will be extremely useful. For a long time, we've been working to develop transparency and build awareness amongst countries, especially developing nations, that represent a very large number of members of the forum, and they see that the benefits of transparency really do go to a great extent to developing nations, because of the fact that a lot of money has been bled out of those countries, and those countries need to recover those resources, and they suffer from tax avoidance and illicit financial flows. And so that's where, as the Global Forum, we've really focused our attention in most recent years. One of the mainstays of the work of the Global Forum, if you like, is capacity building and training, because we feel that it's essential. All of us who are part of this family believe that it's essential to focus our efforts in those countries where they are most needed. And one of the principal axes of our work is technical assistance and capacity building. So as I've said, it's one of the mainstays of the work that the Global Forum has focused upon. The regional initiatives were started off in 2014 in Africa. There were a lot of African countries who are members of the forum. Then we moved to, in 2017, signing a New Zealand agreement. And that's where we started to understand that regional development is perhaps easier for countries in a region to focus their efforts from within the Global Forum. Because if we look at the characteristics of the regions, of these groups of countries, they're quite similar. They have very close relations. And we believe it's more effective and efficient if we focus our efforts in regions. And we can see that over the last few years, there has been a lot of success in terms of transparency. And because we believe in regional development and regional efforts, and the fact that it's much more productive for countries, and we now have the Latin American initiative, and we also most recently have the Asia Pacific initiative. We believe that this is one of the biggest successes of the Global Forum, this regional development, and Saida has showed us in this first transparency initiative status report, and the report that was published just a few months ago. I don't exactly remember when, because things are moving very fast at the moment. We are seeing very clearly how the results speak for themselves, not only in terms of the amounts of money and revenues that have been recovered or generated, but the number of countries who are engaging in exchange of information and benefiting from it. So there's a kind of feedback loop that's being created amongst them. There are countries who are benefiting from this exchange. They're learning how to use exchange of information mechanisms, and they also understand that exchange of information is a means to an end, not the end in itself. It helps them to better manage resources, better use public resources in order to bolster their own economies. I could provide you with numerous examples. I was looking at the report for Africa for this year, and that provides lovely examples such as Rwanda and Kenya, countries who have told us their success stories. And I would encourage countries in Latin America to really understand how important transparency is. I mean, we're seeing the proof of that in the figures, and we know we're on the right track. But it's important that we awaken policymakers and decision makers to the importance of transparency, that tax administrations understand the advantages that this can bring, and the need to develop IT and infrastructure in order to further promote and enhance the results and be successful. Like I say, this is the third edition of the report, and we're seeing more and more success stories coming out of the reports. The Latin America initiative is lagging slightly behind Africa, but we have a very good benchmark, although the countries for many different reasons are quite different. But I believe that we're all in the same boat, and we understand the importance of transparency for all of our economies, and especially, as I've said, for developing economies. Success stories, yes, there are many. And we have the Asia Pacific initiative that's just got off the ground, which I'm sure will also be another example of a great success story. The development of regional initiatives also has the advantage of synergies that exist amongst the countries within the region, and the dynamic of mutual assistance is positive as well. In other areas, we can talk about assistance between countries in the north and the south. So the impulse is there, the impetus is there, and countries are being encouraged to get in the boat with us. And it's a real pleasure this afternoon to have been able to address you. And I'm here to answer any questions that you might have.
That's great. Thank you so much. I mean, the question I had was about capacity building, because you mentioned that a few times, that capacity building is really important to actually how countries do this. I just wonder, what exactly do you do, and what are you finding are the key challenges countries are having in that area?
Well, I think the Global Forum training and capacity building initiatives in the region and amongst all the members, and something that Saida mentioned, we have induction programs, for example, for automatic exchange of information. When a country decides to engage in exchange of information, we can provide them with a tailor-made package of training for them. We were providing in-person training, but with the current situation, we know how things are. We also do things on training on beneficial ownership, so-called last mile, so that we can find out as much information as possible. So training, capacity building, trainer for trainers, courses for auditors, so that they can understand how important information is and how to use the information properly during their audits, etc. Also, what tax laws there are, what can be done, what cannot be done, how to use systems to effectively gather information. We have a whole series of toolkits that we put together within the Global Forum, and we have training packages. And within the Global Forum, I would say this is perhaps becoming increasingly important, and of all of the areas of work, I think this is perhaps the one that has grown the most, because forum members have grown in number. And obviously we're targeting developing countries, and there are other countries such as Spain, for example, who for 30 years have been engaged in exchange of information. So their experience is very different. And in order for exchange of information to be beneficial really and truly, then that training is absolutely necessary. And when I talk about capacity building, I was mentioning auditors before, but politicians and decision makers also need to understand the benefits that transparency will bring. And the Global Forum works from the bottom up, if you like. And the idea is to build awareness from the bottom to the very top levels of the benefits that transparency and exchange of information provide.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Well, I'd like to bring in some of the other panelists too, because particularly picking up on this theme of the political, the top and bottom, gaining support from all areas. So if I could turn now to Mr. Dickinson, please. I'd just be very interested to understand, how you see the role of tax transparency in an exchange of information and mobilising revenues for development. I mean, what progress have you seen, and what do you say the challenges are to making sure all Latin American countries can actually benefit and participate in that?
Thank you, Emma. Hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Good.
Thank you.
And thank you, Chair Zaida, for the readout and the report. I guess one of the important starting points is to set this agenda in the context of the crisis, because I think around 10 or 11% of tax revenues were dropped between 1919 and 2020. And tax administrations and ministries of finance were doing all they could to support households and firms with measures like tax referrals. But at the same time, it seems very clear that governments in Latin America and beyond, their tolerance for tax evasion and tax avoidance has hit an all-time low. So I think that if anything, the tax transparency agenda has risen up the political agenda. And as you were saying, Emma, the up to 5 or 6% of GDP is lost to evasion and some aspects of avoidance. So this agenda is not a luxury item. And I think that we need to recognize that. And obviously, international taxation competes with all sorts of domestic priorities. But I think as the world engages on making progress on not just information exchange and transparency, but on the BEPS measures, it's right that all countries devote as much time as they can to engaging in this process and working out what they can get out of it. So I think we've seen enormous progress on international taxation, and the Global Forum has certainly set the pace going back to 2009. I think it's important to pick up on what previous speakers have said about the need to provide support to developing countries in particular. The complexities of exchange of information and the BEPS agenda are highly complex. And I think the need for capacity building and other support measures, they're not going to go away. And in fact, they're going to get more and more intense. And if we look at in addition, at the historic agreement on the digitalization of the economy from the 1st of July, the needs are immense, and they relate to the transparency agenda too. So I think there's a couple of initiatives that I would highlight as being very complementary to what the Global Forum is doing in terms of support. We have something that we've established at the OECD with the UN called Tax Inspectors Without Borders, which has its origins in the extending that to the criminal investigation work. And I'm pleased to announce that we're now supporting Costa Rica, Honduras, and Colombia on a new set of criminal investigation work, which really cuts to the heart of the practical support that countries need. And most countries tell us that they're kind of beyond the theoretical training level, and they want highly practical support that will make a dent, particularly when it impacts on revenues and the domestic resource mobilization agenda. So that's one issue. I'd like to highlight that Argentina has stepped up to establish an academy for tax and financial crime investigation in Buenos Aires. And again, that's something that provides practical support on work that directly relates to the evasion agenda. In doing this, none of this is possible without the support of partners, and I think that applies to the Global Forum as much as it does to the OECD. So the World Bank and IDB and SEAT all stand out in the region. I think there's a big question about the participation of all countries in the international tax discussions, and I would like to say again that I think the Global Forum going back 10 years has really set the pace. I think the 139 countries that have come together on the BEPS agenda have learned a lot from the way in which the Global Forum operates, and as I said, 132, I think we are now, are advancing together to work on the digitalization of the economy and a global tax rate. I think our experience in all of these international tax dialogues tells us three things that seem to go together in a kind of virtuous circle. One is it's essential that all countries have a voice in the rule setting work, and the inclusive framework has made rapid progress there in recent weeks on the 1st of July agreement, and you can see that many of the measures there will directly support the needs of developing countries. A second item is that guidance is very much needed to help countries to implement some of these complex rules. And then thirdly, what seems to go hand in hand with those two measures is highly practical support. And as I said, seems that the demand has moved on beyond the theoretical to the highly practical that can make an impact on revenue in particular and domestic resource mobilization. So let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's interesting to hear, as you say, that countries are focused on, the nuts and bolts. They wanted to know how they can do this and how much money they can bring in as quickly as possible, I'd imagine. So that is interesting. Thank you. Just wanted to move on to Mr. Estefao now, because the World Bank Group has also been one of the partners supporting this work. And I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what would you say that have been the main challenges and obstacles to promoting the tax transparency agenda, and how do you think the World Bank Group has helped that and helped to overcome some of those obstacles?
Thanks so much, Emma. Para terço da América Latina que não fala espanhol, eu peço desculpa, vou responder em espanhol. Em verdade, sim, a renda de transferência fiscal.
I will answer in Spanish. The tax transparency agenda, financial integrity, and tackling corruption, tax evasion, money laundering, and illicit financial flows is of the highest priority to the World Bank Group. Generally speaking, the World Bank Group supports countries' efforts to tackle illicit financial flows through three lines of action. They promote transparency, they improve capacity to prevent, detect, and deter illicit flows, and by promoting cooperation and exchange of information at national level and at international level. You might ask, why is that agenda a priority for us? Well, illicit financial flows, they drain crucial resources which should be devoted to development, and they impose limitations on the provision of public services, and they also create instability in the integrity of capital markets, and they impede resilience and hamper inclusion and growth, and they create inequality and social injustice and faith in governments and authorities, and they don't help promote reforms, even tax reforms. And we're talking about what taxation information, we're talking about challenges. And these are important goals for us. The bank and the Global Forum have cooperated for a very long time. Since 2011, that cooperation became stronger because we united our efforts in the support we provide Latin American countries and the Caribbean when it comes to making progress in national reform. The support we give includes technical assistance for exchanges upon request and automatic exchanges information, which includes, amongst other things, recommendations on setting up an exchange unit, matters of confidentiality, for instance, how to ensure the confidentiality of information, and support as regards the legal framework. We also provide beneficial ownership registry support, the so-called ultimate beneficial ownership in Latin America. UBO is its acronym. Well, the different terminology is used in different countries. So we support projects when drawing up draft bills and developing action plans in order to implementing the proper registries. The World Bank Group provides technical assistance, and very often that is supplemented by credit operations in order to facilitate the implementation of reforms, including those when it comes to digitalization of registries. This is an agenda, it's an issue which is very important to us, and we provide a great deal of technical assistance here. Of those countries in the region that have benefited from these policies of the Global Forum and the bank, we have Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, Panama, Paraguay, and Peru. The pandemic has just strengthened our commitment to continue to support these countries so that they continue to make progress on this agenda. And I've mentioned already that from the tax angle, it supports mobilization of domestic resources, which is so necessary, but it also contributes to improving equity and progressivity in tax systems. In particular, it offers robust frameworks, and the UBO, which I mentioned earlier, and automatic exchanges also facilitates things, the collection of income tax and other taxes. There are different types of taxes, of course, but we're talking about new modules here, which are part of this instrument in the National Impact Assessment that is also carried out. Many will recognize that this is part of what we do when combating money laundering and the funding of terrorism. There are two new modules for national risk assessment then, and they help these countries with their impact assessment and to assess the threats and vulnerabilities. They can cooperate with legal entities in carrying out these impact assessments. These modules are being implemented in various countries in the region, and we have to cooperate fully, even within the World Bank. The macroeconomic group works together with the finance group, so there is cooperation in the World Bank, and together we are doing what we can in order to improve the tax system, but also the information gathering system. Thank you.
Thank you for such a full answer. And I also think it's very relevant, all the things that you said in relation to, the social equity side of things. It's not just obviously technical and revenue, but it just shows, other impacts that this important issue has. Thank you. So I'm now going to move on to our next panelist, Mr. Verdi. I wanted to really, ask you about the progress in terms of actually working with tax administrations from the region. What's that been like? Have you been able to get them to prioritize this over the many competing things that have been going on? particularly over the last year of the pandemic. So yeah, what's that been like working with tax administrations in the region?
Muchas gracias, Emma. Quería agradecer a María José Garde.
Thank you. I wanted to thank María José Garde and Saida for the invitation to this webinar. And I would like also to congratulate our president, Mercedes Marcó del Pont, and all panelists and the more than 260 participants. So many friends are here. I wish I could welcome you all personally. But to answer your question, I think we're doing okay. I think that things are developing smoothly here. I would endorse what Saida and Mercedes said and what Marcel said, in fact. So I'm going to try and focus on this from a different angle. If we look at processes and events, the Global Forum, well, international transparency and the exchange of information is a process. And it's a process which launched the biggest revolution that I've ever seen in the last 20 or 30 years in the tax area. I never thought that we would be receiving data from more than 100 countries automatically. I never, as an auditor, would have dreamt that that would have happened. So if you ask, we're doing very well. There are 13 countries to observers, etc. It's a process. It started in 2013. It's been almost 10 years. But not all activities are allocated the same priority in every single country, because our countries have all sorts of priorities. Our BEPS, our base erosion, is more complicated than that of many other countries that are developing, because we have an erosion of internal tax base, a huge one, and we have huge internal evasion, higher than that of developed countries. And the same on the exchange of information. Look, there are some countries in the region that are authorized to exchange information at international level. That's great, great. But they don't have access to bank data for their own tax administrations. So there's a lot of work still to be done. The exchange of information is not only at international level. That's very important to recognize. We have to have access to domestic information too in the entire region. How many countries in the region know how much they've spent with their credit card? Not on what, but how much? What about those luxury goods they bought, the houses? So there's still quite a lot of progress to be made when it comes to a national exchange of information and with third parties and at global level. And that's where the Global Forum's role is important. It should push us. It should push our authorities, our politicians, to recognize that they cannot hide behind what should be transparent. So I think we're doing okay, but there is some progress to be made, and we can still continue to grow here in all countries. Why all countries? Well, either we harmonize tax powers, which are not the same in all regions, and some headway has to be made in some countries as regards a legal framework for this. And we also have to make progress on the use of information, because we're not all prepared in the same way to provide quality data. We've made some headway, but not everyone is at the same level. And then how to manage that information, how to analyze that data that one receives. We have some progress to be made there, and extract from that information what is of strategic use to us in order to go to the bank and to those that are carrying out abuses and using loopholes, the loopholes that exist. So I think that there's been a great deal of progress made in the region. When I look at this and what we're doing with the Global Forum and the BEPS and other global initiatives, those are the main ones. I think that is great, and we should applaud the progress that has been achieved, because it's a process. It's not a concrete event, a one-off. It's a continuous process. We have to discuss with our politicians, we have to approve laws, etc., and all that takes time. So I think we're doing a great deal of headway, and we're going quite well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you explained that, very, very interestingly, and all the competing demands. And from my perspective, covering global tax, I found it interesting that it was obviously the national level as well as the global level that you have to marry the two things together. So really, really interesting. Thank you. I'd like to now move on to our next panelist, Mr. Pinada. Sort of picking up on some of the themes that we have just discussed about dealing with things at the regional and national level, as well as the global level. I really wanted to understand, what are the political difficulties or maybe technical difficulties involved with that, and how has your organization been supporting Latin American countries to get over those obstacles?
Thank you very much, Emma, and I'm also going to switch to Spanish given the audience.
Absolutely.
Comienzo con un sincero agradecimiento.
I would like to start off by thanking you for giving me the opportunity to take part in this very important panel, and I'd like to very warmly thank and welcome all panelists. It's a great honor to share this panel with you. Now, as regards your question, Emma, what are the main challenges that we see with looking ahead in the region? I underscore what all panelists have said to date, so I will just focus on some of the issues which I find are key. We see some major challenges looking ahead. First of all, the deficiencies in capacity when it comes to properly using the information, as many of my colleagues have already mentioned. One thing is getting the information, the international information, and the other thing is using it effectively. And tax administrations in Latin America and the Caribbean still face many important challenges when it comes to capacity and when it comes to using the information, because their data processing systems are inadequate or not up to date, or because we don't have sufficient tools or sufficiently advanced analytical facilities. In the past, just about all tax administrations had access to a great deal of information, not only as a result of international exchanges of information, but because of millions of digital invoices. But in order to be able to use this very rich information and convert it into action, into concrete action, which will result in greater tax collection, is something where some headway still needs to be made. And there are many opportunities here too, opportunities to improve and to strengthen our capacity. So what are we doing in the Inter-American Development Bank? What have we done in the past, and what can we continue to do in the future in order to strengthen capacity? In the IDB, we have supported the region technically and financially when it comes to implementing the global tax transparency agenda in different areas, for instance, by eliminating the bank secrecy, as Marcio mentioned, and by eliminating bearer shares, and activities related to identifying beneficial ownership of property. I think that the bank, together with a global forum, has developed a manual, a toolkit for beneficial ownership. But we have also strengthened capacity in tax administrations in order to ensure that they can properly use the information they receive, that they can properly use it and use it effectively. At the moment in the IDB, we have a very robust portfolio of activities for the region in order to strengthen their capacity, very much focused on the use of data. We have loans which reach almost 500 million, which we have provided to them, and we've been doing this for some years now. The main challenge is to continue to offer support along the same lines, especially when it comes to enhancing transparency and exchange of information. So that's the first challenge that I wanted to mention, and what we're doing about it and can continue to do. A second challenge, which we think also exists, is that culture of international tax cooperation. There have been some headway here and in incorporating this culture, but there's still some gaps. In Europe, for instance, there is a propensity to international cooperation in the region, but that has become much more institutional only since 2012 in the Global Forum. So we think it is a challenge for our region to continue to internalize the importance of regional cooperation, and institutions such as us, such as the CIAT and the World Bank Group, have an important role to play here. I think that in this context, something that was omitted, that was missing in the past, something that we see in the Punta del Este Declaration now, is that instrument that will help push this cooperation along. In the past, we didn't have an instrument that properly articulated international cooperation within the region. We think that the Punta del Este Declaration is a very valuable instrument because it will allow us to coordinate and articulate this cooperation in the region. So we think it is key, and we in the bank are committed to continue to support the Punta del Este initiative in order to strengthen this institutionalization of cooperation mechanisms and overcome the basic challenges that the Punta del Este agenda has identified, and to strengthen capacity too, and in so doing, make much better and much more effective use of the information we receive. And we hope that this will result in better collection of revenues for our countries, because we need that. Thank you very much, Emma.
Thank you. Thank you. Great answer. Really interesting to hear about the importance of the declaration and sort of pulling together political impetus in this area as well. So thank you. Oh, I've just seen that there's a question come through, and I just wanted to kind of remind everybody listening that hopefully we'll have time for a few questions at the end. So please do post them in the chat. Right, so can we go on to our next panelist now, who is Mr. Ruiz. I hope I've said that right. I really wish I could speak Spanish right now. Unfortunately not. But thank you so much for being here. One of the other panelists earlier on mentioned that Argentina had developed a tax academy, particular to sort of drive this issue of transparency and exchange of information. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about that, and also more generally, what has motivated Argentina to strongly engage with promoting this topic? Thank you.
Hola, ¿se escucha?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Argentina tiene un fuerte compromiso con el
Argentina has a very strong commitment to exchange of information. We were an early adopter back in 2017, and we've been engaged in exchange of information since then. And this has led us to, over time, evolve in the area. I'd like to particularly highlight, in regard to your question, Emma, the efforts that are being made by Argentina and focus on Latin America and go back to the Latin America Fiscal Transparency Report. I'd like to say that enormous efforts have been made, but we still see big challenges in terms of enhancing tax collection and being able to tackle tax evasion, corruption, and money laundering. Illicit fiscal flows represent quite large amounts of money, and we understand that the tax administrations and governments need to understand how important this is, and they need to take measures to reinforce their work and apply international standards. And we're seeing gradually how Latin American countries are using the different tools available so that they can implement greater tax transparency, but they need to make more efficient and effective use of exchange of information mechanisms. The number of on request exchange of information, the amount of on request exchange of information has increased. We're also seeing spontaneous exchange of information if we consider the BEPS action number 5. But tax information exchange is still key for transparency on the international stage and for the global forum. And the global forum is doing a lot in order to ensure that the mechanisms are implemented effectively. We've tried to introduce reforms and enhance the practical implementation of rules and regulations, and more particularly on the issue of beneficial ownership. Exchange of information can guarantee the effective implementation of such standards, and they are very reliable and useful tools that can be used by the different jurisdictions. If we compare the use of these tools with what jurisdictions in other parts of the world do, there are a number of things that have to be taken into consideration. There are still jurisdictions who have very few international tools available for them to carry out effective exchange of information. The majority of countries do little tax information exchange, and in some countries, measures are still needed in order for automatic exchange of information to be fully implemented. As has been said, these mechanisms are only available in a few countries, but that situation, as a result of what we're hearing in these meetings, is changing. Countries still face obstacles when using the information that's been exchanged for uses other than tax purposes, as our colleague has said about banking information, information on money laundering, etc. So in order for us to attain the objective, we have to have the commitment from the whole of the region to devote specific resources, both human and technological, to reinforce specific activities such as the creation and improvement of units specialized in this within the tax administration, as well as to strengthen the legal frameworks and use exchange of information mechanisms to get information from other countries. And I think the Punta del Este Declaration is a good starting point to get this local commitment to generate resources that can be used by us in order to achieve these objectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting points. I would just like to come on to our last panel list before we open up to Q&A. So if I could ask Mr. Marino, how does your organization as a civil society organization see the role and impact of tax transparency and the issue of exchange of information? Do you think that enough progress has been made, and where would you like to see future progress or future focus?
Sí, bueno, primero, buenos días, buenas tardes.
First of all, good afternoon to everybody. I'm very grateful for having been invited to take part in this forum. I think the Punta del Este Declaration is very important in fiscal transparency and to tackle illicit financial flows. Many civil society organizations have had this subject on their agenda for the last 20 years, work done on the issue of banking secrecy and international corporate activities, and exchange of information is very important. Latin America And civil society has started to promote this through networks in order to create a space for this to be discussed. And with the Punta del Este Declaration, we see this as an important milestone in the creation of tools that are so necessary to push forward this debate. We also consider that some important work has been done by many international organizations, such as the Global Forum, the OECD, and the BEPS initiative, and other organizations that are also trying to create tools and initiatives. The United Nations and other organizations are looking at transparency and exchange of information. There are a number of proposals, such as the implementation of different agreements on exchange of tax information about bank accounts, business bank accounts, and country-by-country reporting systems and beneficial ownership registers. And these are all tools that need to be further developed. So civil society organizations for a number of years now have been calling for and supporting such initiatives, but it's still not enough because of how important these issues are. We still have a lot of work to do, a lot of ground to cover, but it's absolutely essential that governments play their part and implement measures in order to tackle tax fraud. They are very often being limited in terms of tackling illicit financial flows because of the fact that there are certain entities that facilitate this, such as legal firms who can find ways of means of enabling this to happen. So they must also be called to account. What's also very important is that not only should countries have access to that information, but they'd also need to know how to use it effectively and make the most of what it can provide. And more companies need to be involved in countries, especially where this is possible. We also need to discuss the needs for mechanisms to be put into place to help developing countries to recover revenues that might otherwise be lost. Local needs must be identified, and we have to find ways to bridge the gaps in terms of financial capacities, technological capacities within the financial institutions and tax administrations. So there is still much to be done to tackle financial flows, illicit financial flows, but we need to identify the needs of countries in order to put the appropriate measures into place. So, like I say, there is still much to be done. But beyond the initiatives that we've already heard about and meeting minimum standards and providing technical capacity, there is another important point, which I think has been highlighted with the creation of this initiative. from an international point of view, we also have to make sure that everyone can participate on an equal footing, and therefore the needs of the developing countries really have to be met. As civil society organization, we see fiscal transparency as a way of improving the situation at national level, and it requires further support and focus at the national level. There are a number of criteria that we promote, for example, fiscal fairness, and reforms have to make sure that people aren't repeatedly incurring in tax fraud. And at regional level, certain fiscal measures could be introduced to make sure that the most wealthy pay sufficient taxes and bring an end to this race to the bottom that we see in some tax administrations and the ensuing loss of public revenues. Also from civil society, we call for the discussion around this important problem that we face of the erosion of tax bases and what large corporations do in order to avoid paying the tax that they should. So I think really this is more or less what I wanted to say in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we've only got a few minutes for questions, but one has come in and it's for Mr. Ruiz. So it's a question: how does the exchange of information contribute to the efficient implementation of personal income tax in Argentina and the recently implemented extraordinary contribution? So yeah, your thoughts on that, please.
Thank you very much. In Argentina's case, exchange of information, if we remember that in 2016, we were talking about some 52,000 accounts upon whose information we could base. We now have some 650,000 accounts that we get information from. So this is an extremely interesting and useful tool, because it helps us to match the information that we have, and we can cross-check it with amounts that have been declared, wealth tax declared, etc. And on the basis of that, we can carry out the necessary tax inspections to see whether what's been declared is in actual fact what's been earned. In 2018, there were 3 big tax inspections, 524, and then in 2021, we've done over 1,000 such inspections. So the amount, a number of resources that is being put into exchanging information and seeing it as a strategic area for our administration is enormous, and we're now reaping the benefits. We're using that information on an ongoing basis, especially amongst the wealthiest taxpayers, without that meaning that we're not looking at specific cases as well at the same time.
Thank you for that. Right, well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our session. So I just wanted to thank everybody, all our amazing panelists, and all of you for listening in. I think for me, it's kind of reassuring to hear the degree of progress that has been made. And we heard talk of the pride of actually getting together as a region to support Latin America in this area. And obviously there seems to be still some difficulties with the capacity building of countries and tax administrations and the wider framework, but it sounds like many partners are involved in moving towards greater exchange and greater revenue collection as a result. So that's what I took from it. I hope that our panel and all of you watching also found it interesting, and thanks very much to everyone for being involved. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Emma. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Emma. So now it's for me to introduce the second panel to be moderated by Mr. Juan Arguibay Molina from the economic crime department of the Prosecutor General's office in Argentina. And he's going to talk to us about the program that they have introduced in Latin America. My apologies, because I thought I was going to be able to attend the closing part of this panel discussion, but unfortunately I have another commitment that I have to attend to. So I do apologize for not being able to stay until the end, but I wish you a very productive meeting. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this panel discussion. This is an issue I've been working on for quite some time now, and it's a pleasure to be able to share this with experts on the subject. We're going to follow the same dynamic as the previous roundtable, and I'm going to start with Mr. Carlos Vargas, who comes to us from the tax administration in Costa Rica. He'll go first, and then he'll be followed by Ms. Grace Perez Navarro, Deputy Director for the CTPA, and he'll be followed by Mr. De Frutos from the IDB, and we will finish up our discussion with Mr. Andres Nobel, who comes to us from the Tax Justice Network. And we have Mr. Vega, the Executive Deputy Director from the Fiat, but we don't know whether he will in fact be able to join us. I would just like to say that identifying beneficial owners when we're talking about legal entities is one of the axes of public policies that seek to attain transparency. Here, many advances have been made in so far as identifying essential registers of beneficial owners. But I'd like to tell you about something I personally have experienced, and how for a number of countries, our country is conducting interdisciplinary seminars coordinated between different public bodies, together with civil society, with a view to creating awareness on this matter and its importance in the region. It's quite unique and has certainly been one of the sources of communication and dissemination of the importance of identifying beneficial owners, and it's helped us to build awareness amongst different civil society and public sector actors. And that was the whole idea, to promote public policies that strive to shed light on information, practices and customs that are hidden from authorities, generating illicit fiscal flows and allowing crime to be perpetrated, tax avoidance, evasion, corruption and money laundering.
Evaluar las medidas que se han adoptado en América Latina en aras a mejorar la
To assess the measures that have been adopted in Latin America to enhance beneficial ownership and tax transparency is a key. And we have to understand the advantages of the different approaches that the different countries have taken, and the members of this panel. It's important to understand what those are.
And
also it is important to know how efficient monitoring and sanctioning mechanisms are when there is lack of compliance. This will allow us to learn from the experiences, mistakes, and successes of the different approaches. So the goal of this session is to discuss the main challenges and weak points that have been identified in the current beneficial ownership frameworks in Latin America,
and provide a general
see what solutions we can find to strengthen standards and to ensure that they are efficient when it comes to misuse on the part of persons and legal structures. So we're going to begin the conversation on this panel with Carlos Vargas, and I would like to ask him, what can he say with respect to the experience of Costa Rica? They have implemented a central beneficial ownership registry. So what can he tell us about that? For instance, why did Costa Rica decide to do that? And why did they host it in the central bank? And can he give us some practical details on how the work is coordinated and how supervision is coordinated between the central bank and the tax administration? Carlos, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Juan, too, for giving me the chance to address you today. And thank you for being here and for inviting me. And I'd like to say hello to the other panelists. They're my friends for many years now. And we've fought many battles together on this issue in particular, in fact, but on many other issues too. When it comes to Costa Rica, well, we have many years now try to commit to increasing transparency, international transparency, and the exchange of information. And we have periodic assessments that the Global Forum has carried out in our country, and they tell us then, after those, where we could improve. I see it as a way of improving rather than deficiencies. Deficiency, which will help us strengthen our systems, because it's an ecosystem, really, isn't it? We had the multilateral convention on mutual exchange of administrative assistance, which helps us exchange of information, spontaneous exchange, or automatic exchange, or upon request. And we had, for that, to carry out some adjustments to our standards and to our legal framework in order to provide access to information to the administration, especially on this case on beneficial ownership. And sanctions, the sanctioning mechanisms too, because an obligation without accompanying sanctions is an invitation to comply with your duty, but it's not strong enough really to make it as binding as we would like it to be. In the case of Costa Rica and in our assessment of 2015, that of the Global Forum told us that we had to improve when it came to identifying legal beneficiaries, especially beneficial owners. And we embarked on this in a joint manner, together with the Costa Rican Drug Institute, for instance, because the International Financial Action Group also follows up what we are doing, and they cooperate with the OECD and the Global Forum on this issue. So all this cooperation allowed us to strengthen our mechanisms, not only when it comes to fighting money laundering, but tax evasion locally and at international level. Now, my friend was talking about the exchange of information, of financial information, and there are some paradoxes with our case. I call it as a paradox that we have access to financial information and we are free to exchange information, but for internal use, we have to jump hurdles. As regards the register of beneficial ownership, the information comes to the central bank. The central bank is in charge of administering, of setting up and administering the platform by law. And the reason for that is quite important in our opinion. And for legislator, the issue of security, the security of the information was vital. Safeguarding the information and access to the information was also key. So the central bank is the one in charge of dealing with anything to do with interbank payment platforms and with security. So those are very strong points. And so the bank is very strong when it comes to the safe and secure management of money and financial exchanges. So legislators decided that the central bank would be the one that would hold the registry in order to ensure that there was legal certainty for investors too, local and international ones, when it came to where the information was held. We began in 2019, at the end of 2019, by presenting a first block of declarations, because the register not only includes information on legal persons or legal entities, companies, but it also includes information on trusts and non-profit organizations. It's a gradual process. So we started with the most wide-ranging, more than 250,000 legal persons submitted their declaration in 2019, providing details on who the legal holders of the shares were. And in the case of the lodging of declarations on the part of legal persons, they had to provide enough information so that we could see who the beneficial owner was. This was accompanied by different mechanisms that were established to sanction those that didn't comply with their income tax declarations this year. I think that the experience has been quite successful. There was a steering committee that was set up. It was chaired by the central bank. The Ministry of Finance is involved, as is the Drugs Institute of Costa Rica. And we meet periodically, 1 or 2 times a month, in fact. We meet in order to see what headway we are making and how the different action plans that linked to the registry are advancing. Now in October, or rather, well, in October, it's a deadline for submitting your declaration as regards all trusts. So we're closing the cycle. And the bank has been working with analytic access tools for the data that we received, because that's very important for the tax work we do, and it's important for the Drug Institute because it's important for their intelligence activities. Last year, we started through the exchange of information to receive some requests for beneficial ownership information, and we did fulfill those obligations. So it's been a challenging process. We had to set up the platform, and we had to make sure that the administration had all elements necessary to it for secure access to the information. So the administration had to follow up on requests from the central bank. It had to drop information access protocols, which are very rigorous, in order to ensure that the information is secure and confidential and remains so. It was a precondition set up by the business sector. And we, as administration, had to certify the security of the information. So we did comply with that. We're talking about recording mechanisms internally and externally, so you can see who's coming in, security codes, a series of protocols then were developed in order to have access to the information and ensure its confidentiality, its effective use, and the security of the information. Thank you, Carlos. Could I interrupt, please? Could you give us a concrete idea on how Costa Rica uses that information for its tax inspections? So what is the value of the information? How do you use it? Of course, the law stipulates different ways in which one can have access to the information in a well-regulated fashion. First, in cases of tax inspection or investigations, the officials in the tax administration have access then to that information to carry out their tax inspections. Then the staff, authorized staff of the large taxpayers in the country also have access to the information because they have to carry out their own tax management affairs. And then another element which is important to us when it comes to risk management, which is something that we're also developing, is access for tax intelligence issues. We have an intelligence unit, and they are in charge of processing the different sources of information that are available. So they have access to that information, and they include it in their risk assessments that they carry out in order to determine what action we are going to take, preventive or corrective action with each taxpayer. Furthermore, and lastly, we are modernizing the way in which we manage the larger contributors, larger taxpayers, net worth individuals then, and entities. And we're looking at this from the preventive angle. So we want to make sure that they comply fully as far as possible. And access to that information is very valuable for that too, to all those people that are in charge of this so that they know who their clients are. Perhaps you mentioned it, but could you repeat how long the registry has taken to set up? How long have you needed to get it going? The law, the law to combat tax fraud, and that's what it's called. It's the one that helped us create the registry. That was approved at the end of 2016. It took about, well, a bit more than 2 years to develop the IT necessary to make the platform available so that people could submit their declarations. Some of the information is public, and that information can be extracted from where it is and can be made available to those people that need it so that they can complete the additional information that is required. For that, we need to develop the platform, and the other institutions that provide information also had to make their systems compatible to that of the bank. Furthermore, one important issue, again, was that the central bank has the ownership of the digital signature in the country, but everything is done by digital signature. The person that is going to submit the information has to authenticate and validate himself or his identity with a digital signature. There was not mass use of this, but those that had to submit the declaration had to get the certificate, the corresponding digital certificate, so that they could digitally sign in and identify themselves. So the logistics were huge, really. We had to set up the system, verify everything that is needed so that it works together with other institutions, and then see what the preconditions that people had to comply with in order to properly comply with this obligation, especially as regards digital signatures. That was a very delicate issue. You have to take a series of steps internally for that in the bank to obtain a digital signature. So that means that we had to extend the deadline somewhat to September 2019. That was the first declaration that was submitted. And we followed the last digit of the identity card of legal entities. So the process concluded in March 2020. The legislators postponed this by an additional 2 months, so the whole process concluded in May of 2020. So if we're going to force people to submit a new declaration, well, what we did, if there's no change, we said we validate it. If there are changes, then introduce them. If not, give us your declaration of 2021. Excellent, Carlos. That was very clear indeed. Thank you very much for that information. I'm sure we'll come back at the end with more questions. I will now give the floor to the next speaker. I'm going to give the floor to Mrs. Grace Perez Navarro, and I'm going to start with the same question. What about the benefits of having a multi-pronged approach to implement frameworks for beneficial ownership in the region? And could you also tell us about tax transparency, how that supports that? And what about the link with other financial crimes or economic crimes? Grace, thank you very much. Thank you, Juan, and good day to all of you. It's a great pleasure to take part in this event, which follows on from the Punta del Este Declaration. It was my pleasure to participate in that initiative in Punta del Este. I would like to begin with something about your basic question. What do we want to achieve with the transparency requirements for beneficial ownership?
Queremos disuadir la delincuencia a través de reglas que hagan más difícil.
We are looking to put an end to crime that uses tax evasion. And if we can't dissuade criminals, identifying beneficial owners is extremely important in order for us to identify tax fraud and establish the facts in order for us to take legal action against these individuals. So it's extremely important. However, according to the experience of the countries of the FATF and the Global Forum, there isn't a single solution to do this. There have to be peer reviews and the work of the GAFI, the FATF, which have showed that multidisciplinary approach is far more effective. So in order to guarantee the efficiency of the system, joint efforts have to be made by different actors in order for us to implement measures to prevent legal entities being used for illicit purposes and providing precise information about the beneficial owner of companies is important in order for competent authorities to access information in a timely fashion. The variability and availability of sources of information helps to mitigate the problems in terms of inaccuracies of information. And this, amongst other aspects, is very important. So we suggest that the countries in the region consider different approaches. For example, first of all, to require that business registers keep the information that they hold on beneficial owners of companies up to date. Secondly, companies should be required to obtain and maintain information up to date regarding company beneficial owners, or require that necessary and reasonable measures be taken in order to gather and keep update information about the beneficial owners of the companies. And thirdly, use existing information, such as information that can be obtained from financial information, financial entities, information held by other competent authorities, or information held by the companies. That would be the most basic way to try to gather information regarding the beneficial owner, but it's perhaps not the best way to go about it. So it's important to avail oneself of several different approaches in order to attain reliable and trustworthy information. Beyond tax evasion, why is it important to identify beneficial owners? I guess that is the question Juan is asking, and whether this information can be used for other purposes. And my answer is absolutely yes. The possibility of having information about beneficial owners and having it to hand and that it be accessible and reliable is absolutely crucial for authorities to protect their financial and fiscal system of a country. One of the objectives of this policy is to prevent money laundering and to detect corruption where it exists and other illicit financial flows. All of these crimes, as Juan has already said, involve hiding the financial trail, and authorities can conduct due diligence into companies and individuals and advise the tax authorities that certain individuals or companies are involved in some shape or form in illicit or illegal activities. Some information on beneficial owners can also be helpful in collecting taxes. Inspectors can use this information in their own jurisdiction or in collaboration with third countries. And so this can be extremely useful in tax collection. Accessibility of information helps in transparency on markets. This is perhaps less well known, but information on beneficial owners helps companies to get a better understanding of exactly who they're dealing with. For example, when there are acquisitions and mergers, having information about beneficial owners is a good way of avoiding businesses conducting transactions with entities involved in illegal activities. So there's a lot of benefit and advantage to be gained from having information about beneficial owners. Thank you very much, Grace, for being so clear and to the point. I'd like to see whether in just a few short moments you can say whether you've identified any trends in the field of beneficial ownership. What do you see the future brings in terms of implementing rules and regulations around beneficial ownership? I think To be honest, there's a lot of work still yet to be done, and especially in Latin America. I think we will see different approaches being used in more and more countries, centralized registers being created, and all of this needs yet to be improved in all countries. I'd also say that we will see developments in the use of technology for the exchange of this information, or at least to have access to it, to be able to access business registers or through networks that may be created by countries. We're already talking about this as a part of the work ongoing within one of our task force to see whether this information could be made more accessible more quickly. Because when we're talking about, for example, the case of a crime, that information has to be provided immediately. You can't hang around for months and months waiting to get the information. So I believe that all of this will need to really move forward and make use of technology. Thank you very much. We will, I'm sure, come back at the end with more questions. Let's move on now to Mr. Ubaldo Gonzalez de Frutos. And I will again ask him a question. So on the basis of your experience at the Inter-American Development Bank and providing support in terms of beneficial owner policies, I'd like to ask you your opinion on the measures being implemented in Latin America in order to implement these standards, and more specifically, the effective oversight mechanisms, and there will be, I'm sure, many more questions to come. Thank you very much. Good evening. Good afternoon. Thank you to our colleagues from the Global Forum for inviting the bank, and more specifically for inviting me to be here. In terms of oversight, I would say this is the Achilles tendon, the Achilles heel, because we have a number of sources of information, those on the financial circuit and those who lie outside it. We have a series of financial standards and institutions that can keep a good track, and the intermediaries and financial institutions are subject to certain information reporting standards set by the FATF, and there is a certain degree of certainty surrounding them. However, there is another source of information held by companies themselves, and there I believe the challenge is in getting that information and verifying whether companies are actually reporting properly, and if they in fact know who the beneficial owner is. But if I could, I'd like to put this a little bit into context and explain in which countries this is particularly important. We have this limitation of liability, which is really where the limited liability companies come from. And there it's possible to hide the identity of the owner. And there are listed companies, and we have special purpose vehicles that can be created in order to hide the identity of the real beneficial owner of a company. And then we have small and medium-sized companies. But if you use the use a legal agent, a legal entity as a way of hiding who the beneficial owner is, you can have 3, 4, or 5 different people in different jurisdictions, or entities in different jurisdictions that can provide a screen behind which the beneficial owner can actually hide. You can have a company set up in the Bahamas or on the Isle of Man, and you have trust companies that can be set up in places like Gibraltar. And this is important because it's that last layer, it's that last level that is in contact with the banks. And so it's all of these at all of these intermediary levels that you're not going to have information in the financial system regarding who they are. The last example I gave you was Gibraltar. And as I say, this is the Achilles heel. This is where the difficulty lies in identifying the beneficial owner, because those who are the beneficial owners and are interested in transparency, as we're discussing here, make it very difficult to really understand who the beneficial owner is. And that's where it makes it hard to regulate, as the FATF does. What we need is an effective system to help us properly understand who the beneficial owners are of these intermediary companies. I'm sure Carlos will recall when we first set up the register in Costa Rica, the only way we had to control this was to make use of centralized information. I mean, we have two basic versions of this. One, what we did in Costa Rica, or what Costa Rica has done. They've set up a specific register where a declaration has to be made compelling companies to be included in that register. And another sort of softer hand, which is quite effective, is to go down the tax statement route. In a tax administration's database, there will be certain information about the ownership of a company. But if you leave it to the company itself to sporadically request information rather than systematically provide it, what will happen is what Chris has commented. It will take forever. And that's not going to be beneficial in a situation where, for example, a corruption scandal has erupted and you need to know what the chairman or the president of an oil company is in actual fact doing. So that's the context that we find ourselves in. International standards are quite young. They've only been around for about 10 years in the case of the FATF. And the Global Forum has been created, and we are growing and learning from the different experiences. This is not something a tax inspector would look into on a day-to-day basis. We're talking about quite complex tax fraud, which is not something that lands on your desk every day. And will be looked at when certain important things hit the press and investigative journalists uncover, or where there are high-profile cases of corruption, usually in the States and sometimes in Latin America. And we hear about what's been going on because it involves big amounts in bank accounts. Thank you very much once again for that very straightforward explanation. But I'd like to also ask you another quite direct question. If you could tell us how the Inter-American Development Bank is accompanying or supporting tax administrations that don't have the sort of information or capacity to implement a full-blown fiscal transparency program at the moment. Well, thank you very much for that question, because it actually gives me the opportunity to make a plug for the bank. First of all, this is a strategic line of work for the bank. We've, for the last 15 years plus, been trying to promote tax transparency at government level. It's, in fact, another way of attaining transparency. And within fiscal transparency, beneficial ownership is very high on the agenda. We have created a toolkit which is now accessible on the internet, and anyone who's listening who wishes to can download it. It's quite illustrative, it's quite graphic, and it is very explanatory. But you can also contact us if you have any concerns, if you have any questions, or you need some sort of systemic project put into place, and we can avail you of technical assistance, and we can send experts to help do a diagnostic of your situation, and we work hand in hand with the Global Forum, and we can do a gap map to find a critical roadmap to help you overcome whatever problems you may have. We can also help financially with implementing a policy or some form of criminal investigation that you might need to conduct. So we have 145 participants. I was just searching for the number there. So please don't hesitate to contact us, write to us, and if you do have any concerns or questions for us. Thank you very much for that. We're going now to move on. We'll, I'm sure, get more questions at the end of the panel discussion, but I'd like to now move on to Mr. Gustavo Vega from the FATF Latin America, who's just joined us. What I'd like to ask him off the bat is, on the basis of his experience at GAFI-LAT, why all of this is important in tackling money laundering and other important crimes of a fiscal and financial nature. And if you could tell us a bit about his work at the Financial Action Task Force on Latin America within the Global Forum. Thank you very much, Juan, and I do apologize for coming in late. Unfortunately, that's one of the issues with this new technology. Sometimes problems crop up. So to go straight to the point, and in answer to your question, perhaps if you'd allow me to give you a little bit of background about the FATF on Latin America. It encompasses Latin American countries, and we're focusing on the importance of identifying beneficial owners. And in terms of challenges that we've faced in the last 10 years, I can perhaps tell you a little bit about it and the global network. There are certain challenges, and I can definitely confirm how important this issue is, especially when you look at the peer reviews within the Global Forum and in the FATF on Latin America, and how important this is. There are certain mechanisms that can be used to combat money laundering and the financing of terrorism, but they tend to be focused on very robust legal frameworks and legal institutional frameworks.
There is a vulnerability when it comes to identifying the beneficial owner. Nonetheless, the work when it comes to obtaining a robust legal and institutional framework carries less weight. That's what you find when you carry out mutual assessment. You want to know to what extent they're complying with the international GAFI standards and how effective the countries are being when it comes to implementing those standards in the context of their system. One exercise which we carried out, which I'd like to comment on, we did it internally in GAFI-LAT with member states, was updating threats identified regionally in Latin America. We saw that offenses such as drug trafficking, corruption, fraud, tax offenses, which the panelists have referred to, contraband, smuggling, and these new offenses, cyber offenses, environmental crimes, etc., that they're on the up. They represent a greater threat to countries and their systems to prevent and tackle money laundering. So these offenses, these crimes carry more weight economically speaking. They are the ones that normally are quite important, and the criminals themselves, then the ones that carry out the crime, are the ones that have already the economic resources to, for instance, use professional money launderers, and through them they use very complex corporate structures. Then you have those shell companies and the use of offshore companies, bearer shares, nominal directors, and there's always a concentration of this type of use, of this type of crime. We found mainly when we carried out a typology analysis of money laundering in the different countries and an analysis of national impact assessment when it comes to money laundering in the member states. We found less concentration of this type of cooperative ways of financing terrorism and money laundering when we carried out a different analysis. And that is because of how complex it is for the private sector to be aware that this is happening, and that on the one hand, and the other hand, how difficult it is for the authorities to have effective access and opportune access, timely access to information on the beneficial owner, irrespective of the fact that often the countries were quite well graded when it comes to technical compliance. They have a well-founded legal basis, but in practice, it's difficult for them to be effective. That's why it's important to continue to talk about these issues and make progress, because they have a specific impact on crimes which are an ever greater threat in our countries, on the security and the well-being of our countries. Then, how important it is to create a proper synergy between the global forum Gafi-Lat and the global network of Gafi is fundamental. We remember when Gafi began with this issue and the concept of beneficial ownership, it didn't come directly from Gafi. It was a concept which first arose to prevent money laundering. Then Gafi took it over, and then many other organizations have also taken it up because they see that it has an impact on the effective implementation of their mandate in the countries in which they operate. So it's very important indeed. I remember when you get to a country to look at compliance on recommendation 24 of the Gafi, which talks about this, and the country that you get to says, look, everything's fine. Here's the assessment that such and such an organization made, the Global Forum or whatever, that says that we're doing really well and I can share this type of information. Yes, but what was being asked at the time by the Global Forum or whatever organization is not exactly what Gafi is now asking. So there's a lag there. So you have to continue to calibrate all these issues in order to continue to help our countries and the countries that are members of the global network and members of OECD and of the Global Forum. We need to focus on this problem, because when we focus on it and properly understand it, then it would be much easier for us to cut those economic pillars for organized crime. And so that we can have greater trust in structures and institutions at national level. Thank you very much, Gustavo. I wanted to ask you a very topical question. Can you be brief, please, because time is pressing? Can you identify any lesson that you've learned on the basis of your experience that you could share with other countries? Something in concrete terms that you can share here and which will help us learn. Thank you, Juan. That's an interesting question. In all these assessments that we've carried out, we also have to ensure that there is compliance. And we have found that many countries have very strong legal and institutional frameworks, very many strong points, at least in these frameworks, but that there is a tendency to focus on concentrating information on the beneficial owner in a register. So what's the issue there? It sounds really easy. Just put this information in the registry. It's your obligation to do so every so often. If there's any change in the beneficial owner of your companies, well, you tell me in the first 15, 20 days from when it happened, when the change occurred. It all sounds very simple according to the law, but the problems arise in practice, because when these issues are implemented, that's where problems arise in practice, because it's not always that easy to make somebody comply with that requirement. And what's even more difficult is to know when they're not complying or when they're complying badly with their obligations. Those are the main challenges. So when a country decides to rely faithfully and blindly on a register alone, then problems arise, because how can you just rely on that in order to ensure that what the company told you and not cross-check that information? What we've discovered is that when you adopt a multi-pronged approach, it's much better. It's much more practical, of course, to have everything in one register. That's all very fine and good when it comes to being efficient. But what we found is that in order to be effective, it should also be supported by other structures. Try and get information from the private sector and from other entities, for instance, service providers, and have this information at hand when you need it, and ensure that there's the obligation that companies also store that information so that it cross-checked with the information that's in the register. But there's other practices that could be looked at too. For instance, afford the possibility that this register, which is only accessible to national authorities, that it also be accessible to certain people in charge of prevention. Banks, for instance, banks, when it carries out its due diligence, if it has access to those registers, he goes to a person, the person opens an account, and they ask him, well, you come on behalf of this legal person. Who is the beneficial owner of this legal person? And the person that's opening the account has to understand that this is necessary and that there is due diligence that is being carried out. But when they say the beneficial owner is this, it would be good if the bank, for instance, could review a list and see if there's matching. If there's no matching, well, then they should advise the authorities. And that's one way in which the authorities can see if either they're not complying with their obligations or they're telling lies in their declaration. And in both cases, this type of interaction is very useful indeed. It's very useful to countries. It's very useful to preventing and combating money laundering and funding of terrorism, and for the preventing of other crimes like the ones we've discussed, tax crimes, for instance. Thank you. Thank you, Gustavo. That was very clear indeed. Now we go on very briefly with the final panelist, who is Andres Noble, lead researcher in Tax Justice Network. Andres, let's not waste any more time. I just wanted to say, by way of preamble, whether you can give us your opinion on those vulnerabilities that your network, Tax Justice Network, might have discovered as regards the beneficial ownership in Latin America. Thank you, Juan, and thank you everyone for still being here and listening. The approach que utiliza the Tax Justice that the Tax Justice Network uses, as a global forum has said, is to support that a registry of beneficial ownership be drawn up. So that's that's what the approach that we followed, that a governmental authority be the one that has information, and that it has to be asked of it. That, of course, as a minimum, others can have that information too. In Latin America, we have perhaps a vision which is perhaps goes beyond that, demanding problems of bearer shares, for instance. There are many countries that are regulating this or preventing it, but very often the sanctions are not that dissuasive, or not that much of a deterrent in order to make sure that one provides the information, or that the bearer share be in the hands of a bank or a lawyer. It could be offshore too. It makes it very difficult for the state to have information. Then many countries have made some headway as it comes to registries of beneficial ownership. They have at least adopted a law in order to ensure that that information be sent to a member of governments, the central bank, what have you. But often they forget that there are loopholes, there are vacuums when it comes to legal ownership. Not the information has to be updated very often, and all legal ownership data must be provided. If you don't have that first layer of information, there will be a difficulty when it comes to verifying and authenticating the information. Some countries that are making headway with registries for beneficial ownership, they only cover legal entities but not trusts, or they do cover trusts but they don't require people to identify all the parties involved, or they establish thresholds for the identification of beneficiaries. And the Global Forum feels that no threshold should be established. Then there's low compliance. That's understandable. We're in a pandemic situation. Much of this is new, but it's something that continues to be a risk, not only in Latin America, but elsewhere. We have made some progress in Latin America. In Europe, the European Union is at the vanguard, but in Latin America, we are in second place as regards registry. Europe has made some progress, and Latin America not so much, is in public access to information. It's a requirement, at least for a legal person in the European Union, but in our region, not very many countries have instituted this, and it's what civil society is requesting. Thank you. Public access then. And Andres, if you had to identify one obstacle, the main obstacle to make registries for beneficial ownership operative in Latin America, what would it be? That's a good question. There isn't just one obstacle, of course. I would have thought of 5, but I'll be very brief. One is that if you establish a registry by law, not all authorities have access to the information. Only the tax administration or only the central bank, for instance. It's not all authorities that have immediate direct access to the information therein. Then on the other hand, it's important that these registries be interconnected given globalization. The European Union does require that, but not in Latin America. We're far from that. But one thing we have been suggesting is that countries at least exchange in a spontaneous way residency issues. For Argentina could have exchanges with Brazil on, for instance, beneficial owners that are residents in Brazil, for instance. So we could make some headway there. That on the one hand. Then on the other hand, there's very little use of the information, a very little knowledge of the information. What we ask the authorities is that they know what legal mechanisms are available to them, and also to know what it could be considered normal, what's considered not normal. And this has to do with the limited scope, especially with two types of entities. There's a perception that they're well regulated, so you don't have to worry about them too much. Those that have that are listed or investment funds, they're often not properly regulated because you have financial regulators, the stock exchange, etc., but they're thinking about other issues. They're not thinking about evasion and money laundering. So even when they talk about disclosure of beneficial ownership, they refer to other things and not necessarily the define that we use when it comes to tackling evasion and money laundering. We talked a lot about verification, and then you have to know who the final owners are. The beneficial owners are trusts and companies, but you can compare this to immovable registries, vehicles, boats, etc., in order to see what the situation is throughout and not just with regards to the owner of the company. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andres. I'm now going to make a series of questions, which I found in the chat. And I'm going to include one of mine, which is for Grace. And I'm going to start with that. Grace mentioned that they were working on technological developments in order to enhance exchange of information. I'd like to know if that includes technology in order to make international operations even more anonymous. Not thinking only of registries, companies, and bank transfers, but what about technological progress that is being made throughout the world in order to find alternative ways to transfer value and which follow different channels, but which are matters which are indirectly related to the identification of beneficial ownership? Is that part of the analysis that you're carrying out? That's a question directed at Grace. Grace, I think you're muted.
Okay, thank you, Juan. Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, we are working on that issue because we feel that technology is being abused by criminals. So we have to find a way to somehow capture that information. And we have a task force, we have a group that's looking into that. And we are also looking at something you've just mentioned, something the EU is doing, and that's the idea of having a network that has information about beneficial owners in order to be able to more quickly access that information. We're also making headway in tax administration fora. We're discussing the issue of the use of technology in that field. So really, this is perhaps one of the most important subjects of discussion. We've done away with banking secrecy for tax purposes. We've got now automatic exchange of information, and we can't allow the criminals to get a step ahead of us and use technology to circumvent the rules and controls that we've put into place. Thank you very much again, Grace. I'm afraid we now need to wrap this up. Thank you very much to all the panelists for their answers, for being so clear and succinct. And I now give Zaida the floor to close. Thank you, Juan. Thank you to all the panelists for that very interesting discussion. We know it's a subject that's going to be discussed for some time to come, and we know that for everywhere in the world, and especially for Latin America, this is a very important issue in terms of moving forward on the transparency agenda. I'm afraid Mercedes wasn't able to stay with us, as you all know. So on her behalf, I'd like to bring this event to a close. I'd like to start by thanking all the panelists and the facilitators, the moderators, for all of their valuable support and for making this launch of the report on fiscal transparency in Latin America possible and for making it so successful. It's been a very interesting opportunity for us to be able to exchange ideas and views on the subject. The report is showing us that the region of Latin America is really making a lot of headway in fiscal transparency and exchange of information, and it's laying the ground for effective exchange of information. And this is particularly valuable for countries who can then implement effectively the information that they can gather. We've talked about some important pending issues and challenges that still require further work, but I'm sure that with the support of the regional institutions and partners, this will certainly change. So thank you once again to all of the participants for a very productive event today, and I hereby formally bring the first day of this meeting on the Punta del Este Declaration to a close. Thank you very much and good evening.